Even champions don't fight the same way when they face Islam Makhachev. These are not prospects guessing their way through chaos or veterans clinging to survival instincts. These are fighters who have already reached the top of the sport. Men who are used to imposing their will, controlling pace, dictating distance, and forcing opponents to react. And yet, when they step across the cage from Islam Makhachev, something subtle but undeniable happens. Their posture changes. Their decisions slow down. Their confidence narrows. They don't look reckless. They don't look panicked. They look cautious. And that caution is the story. This video is not about techniques, highlight reels, or why Islam wins fights on paper. It's about why champions abandon their usual identities when facing him, why aggressive fighters suddenly become patient, why risk-takers turn conservative, why game plans that worked against everyone else quietly disappear. Because fear, at this level, doesn't show up as chaos. It shows up as restraint. Islam Makhachev doesn't force champions into mistakes the way brawlers do. He doesn't overwhelm them with speed or shock them with violence. Instead, he introduces something far more destabilizing: the awareness that every decision carries a cost they cannot calculate in real time. Against most opponents, champions play to win. Against Islam, they play not to lose. And that single shift changes everything. What you're about to hear is not a breakdown of fights, but an examination of a pattern where elite fighters quietly rewrite who they are inside the cage, not because they are weaker, but because they understand the system they are stepping into. A system designed to punish impatience, confidence, and familiarity. By the end of this video, the question won't be whether Islam Makhachev is dangerous. The question will be why even the best fighters in the world behave like they know they're already behind the moment the door closes. Champions don't lose their identity overnight. It doesn't vanish because of nerves or bad preparation. It erodes when they realize that the habits that made them champions no longer feel safe. Against most opponents, champions rely on a familiar internal logic. Pressure creates mistakes. Volume breaks rhythm. Confidence forces exchanges. Those ideas are reinforced by years of success. They've worked too many times to question. But when champions prepare for Islam Makhachev, that logic starts to feel unreliable long before the fight even begins. The first shift happens in the planning phase. Game plans against elite contenders usually revolve around imposing strengths, more pace, more activity, more risk. Against Islam, the plan quietly flips direction. Instead of asking, "How do we win?" the preparation starts asking, "How do we avoid getting trapped?" That sounds subtle, but it's decisive. A champion who enters the cage trying to avoid something is no longer acting, he's reacting. And champions are not built to react. This is where the psychological imbalance begins. Islam doesn't threaten champions with chaos. He threatens them with predictability. His presence suggests that every aggressive choice leads down a narrowing corridor, one where exits disappear the longer you stay inside. Champions sense this, even if they don't articulate it. They begin to ration their offense. Strikes become singular instead of layered. Combinations shorten. Movement becomes cautious rather than assertive. None of this looks like fear on the surface. It looks like discipline. But discipline driven by uncertainty is not the same as discipline driven by control. Another tell appears in how champions manage time. Normally, champions understand rounds as resources. They build momentum early, bank success, then apply pressure late. Against Islam, time becomes an enemy rather than an asset. The longer the fight progresses, the more the champion feels the weight of cumulative risk. Every minute survived doesn't feel like progress. It feels like exposure. This reverses the usual confidence curve. Instead of growing stronger as the fight settles, champions appear increasingly restrained, increasingly careful, as if the safest moment was already behind them. This is why even elite fighters begin to look slower without actually losing speed. They hesitate at moments where instinct should take over. They wait half a second too long to engage. They disengage when pressure might have paid off. Viewers often interpret this as a tactical error, but it's something deeper. The champion is no longer acting on certainty. He's acting on probability, calculating outcomes instead of enforcing them. and calculation inside a cage is a losing game when the opponent thrives on patience. What makes this effect so powerful is that it doesn't require dominance to function. Islam doesn't need to control every second to influence behavior. The mere threat of what happens if a mistake occurs is enough to reshape how champions operate. Once that threat is internalized, the champion begins to fight a different opponent than the one in front of him. He fights the version of Islam that exists in his own decision-making process, the invisible pressure that punishes initiative. By the end of the first round, many champions haven't lost has already shifted. Their usual assertiveness is gone. Their instincts are muted. They are no longer fighting as champions who expect the fight to bend to them. They are fighting as specialists, trying to survive a system designed to reduce them, slowly and quietly, into something more cautious, more limited, and far easier to manage. Once the fight begins, the difference in how champions behave becomes impossible to ignore. This is the phase where preparation meets reality, and reality forces adjustments that no game plan fully accounts for. Against most elite opponents, champions test boundaries early. They probe with feints, step into exchanges, push the pace just enough to see how the other man responds. Against Islam Makhachev, that probing phase looks fundamentally different. It's quieter, shorter, more restrained. Champions gather information, but they refuse to spend it. The first real hesitation appears in the clinch, even when the clinch is accidental. Against other fighters, champions treat brief tie-ups as transitional moments, something to escape or exploit. Against Islam, those moments suddenly feel dangerous. A hand placed on the wrong side of the body, a step taken slightly out of alignment. A momentary loss of balance, these aren't minor risks anymore. They are potential entry points into a system the champion knows he cannot easily exit. As a result, champions disengage faster than usual. They break contact earlier. They reset instead of pressing advantage. What looks like clean ring IQ is actually a growing refusal to commit. Distance management begins to change as well. Champions who are normally comfortable operating in the pocket widen their stance. They keep the fight at ranges that feel safer but less productive. They circle more, not to create angles, but to avoid straight-line engagement. The cage, which champions often use as a weapon to trap opponents, becomes something they actively avoid. They drift toward the center even when pressure might have forced Islam backward. This spatial caution isn't random. It's informed by an understanding that the cage, against Islam, is not a boundary, it's a trigger. As rounds progress, another pattern emerges. Offense becomes conditional. Champions don't throw because the opening is there. They throw only when they believe the risk is minimal. This dramatically lowers output without any obvious fatigue. Strikes are thrown one at a time, rarely in combination, and almost never followed by positional pressure. The champion is still capable of aggression, but aggression now requires permission. Permission from circumstance, from spacing, from perceived safety. That's not how champions usually operate. What's happening underneath is a breakdown of flow. Great fighters rely on rhythm. They build sequences, chain reactions, and overwhelm opponents through continuity. Islam disrupts that continuity not by interrupting attacks, but by making follow-ups feel dangerous. The champion begins to compartmentalize offense instead of layering it. Each action exists in isolation. Punch, reset. Kick, reset. Feint, disengage. The fight becomes fragmented, and fragmentation favors the fighter who thrives on control rather than momentum. This is also where body language starts to tell the real story. Champions normally look composed even under pressure. Against Islam, they look attentive in a different way. Eyes locked, shoulders tight, posture guarded. They are not relaxed. They are monitoring. Monitoring distance, monitoring timing, monitoring consequences. This constant surveillance consumes mental bandwidth. The champion is still skilled, still dangerous, but he is no longer free. Every movement carries an internal question mark, and once that freedom is gone, the fight subtly tilts. Not because Islam has landed something dramatic, not because he has imposed dominance in a visible way, but because the champion has stopped expressing himself fully. He has entered a version of the fight where survival instincts coexist with ambition, and ambition always loses that battle. By the midpoint of the fight, even champions begin to resemble caretakers of their own safety rather than architects of victory. By the time champions reach the middle rounds, something unsettling becomes clear. The switch they normally rely on doesn't work. Against most opponents, there is always a moment where a champion can decide to change the fight, increase pressure, take risks, force exchanges, or simply impose will. That option usually exists, even when the scorecards are close or momentum feels uncertain. Against Islam Makhachev, that option feels locked behind consequences the champion can't afford to trigger. This realization doesn't arrive as panic, it arrives as restraint. The champion understands, often subconsciously, that pushing harder doesn't just increase reward, it multiplies exposure. Every step forward compresses space. Every extended exchange creates contact. Every attempt to assert dominance opens pathways that cannot be closed quickly. And unlike other fights, where risk can be balanced with athleticism or durability, here, risk feels permanent. One wrong commitment doesn't just lose a moment, it changes the entire fight. This is where champions begin to fight in segments instead of sequences. Rather than building momentum across minutes, they treat each exchange as a standalone event. Win this moment, exit clean, reset. The problem is that segmented fighting strips away pressure. Without continuity, there is no accumulation, no sustained threat. Islam doesn't need to disrupt rhythm because the rhythm never forms. The champion, once known for flow and adaptability, becomes procedural. Another shift occurs in emotional posture. Champions usually carry a quiet confidence that allows them to remain calm even when plans fail. Against Islam, that confidence transforms into vigilance. The fighter isn't frustrated, but he isn't relaxed either. He is aware that the margin for error has shrunk to almost nothing. This awareness creates hesitation at exactly the moments where champions normally trust instinct. Feints go unanswered. Openings are acknowledged but not taken. Opportunities pass without consequence. What makes this especially damaging is that champions know what they're losing in real time. They can feel themselves becoming less dangerous. They understand that output is dropping, that pressure is fading, that the fight is slipping into a pattern they did not choose. But knowing this doesn't provide a solution. The usual adjustment escalation feels irresponsible. The alternative patience feels like slow suffocation. The champion is trapped between two losing options, and neither aligns with the identity that brought him to the top. This is also the stage where physical energy becomes misleading. Observers often note that champions still look fresh. Their breathing is controlled. Their movement remains sharp. But freshness without freedom is meaningless. Energy that cannot be spent aggressively becomes weight. The champion carries it, unable to convert it into dominance, while Islam continues to operate comfortably within the same measured pace. What should be an advantage becomes a reminder of limitation. By the end of this phase, the fight no longer feels competitive in the way champions expect competition to feel. Not because one man is overwhelming the other, but because the direction of the fight feels fixed. The champion senses that time is no longer neutral. It's working against him. And once that realization settles in, even elite fighters begin to fight not to change the outcome, but to survive it with dignity. At some point, champions stop trying to bend the fight and start adapting to it. This is the most dangerous phase, not because mistakes explode, but because acceptance sets in. Against Islam Makhachev, acceptance doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like being realistic. The champion convinces himself that staying composed, staying safe, staying competitive is the correct approach. But this quiet recalibration carries a hidden cost. Once you accept the opponent's rhythm, you surrender the right to redefine the fight. This is where the psychological weight becomes visible, even without dramatic moments. Champions begin to manage the fight rather than shape it. They conserve energy they don't know how to spend. They protect positions they never planned to defend for this long. The urgency that usually sharpens decision-making fades, replaced by a caring advances either. The fight drifts into a holding pattern, and holding patterns always favor the fighter who is most comfortable doing less. What's crucial here is that this isn't passive behavior born from fear. It's strategic resignation. The champion understands that forcing the issue might lead to immediate disaster. while patience at least preserves dignity. So he chooses the safer path, even if it means slowly losing control over the narrative of the fight. This is why so many champions appear composed in later rounds against Islam. Composure, in this context, is not confidence, it's containment. Another tell emerges in how champions respond to small losses. Against most opponents, a lost exchange sparks adjustment. Against Islam, a lost exchange reinforces caution. Instead of responding with increased pressure, the champion tightens further. He avoids repeating the scenario. He removes tools from his own arsenal to reduce risk. Each defensive adjustment feels logical in isolation, but together they strip the champion of unpredictability. Islam doesn't need to read the fight. The fight simplifies itself. This acceptance also alters how champions perceive success. Moments that would normally feel insignificant, a clean disengagement, a defended takedown, a neutral clinch begin to feel like victories. The bar shifts downward without conscious acknowledgement. The champion starts measuring success by survival metrics rather than dominance metrics. That internal recalibration is devastating at the elite level, because winning on points of safety rarely translates into winning on judges' cards or in control of the bout. By now, the champion isn't waiting for an opening. He's waiting for the fight to end. Not because he's exhausted, not because he's broken, but because he understands that the path to reversal no longer exists without unacceptable risk. The fight hasn't been taken from him violently. It has been narrowed, constrained, and quietly sealed off. And once that happens, even the great ease. What ultimately separates Islam Makhachev from other elite champions is not dominance in the traditional sense, but control over identity. Against Islam Makhachev, champions don't just lose rounds, they lose access to the version of themselves that made them champions in the first place. Their tools don't disappear. Their skills don't fail. What changes is their willingness to express those skills freely. And at the highest level, freedom is everything. Islam's system doesn't punish aggression immediately. It discourages it preemptively. Champions understand that forcing exchanges won't necessarily lead to a firefight they can win. It may lead to a sequence they can't escape. That awareness reshapes decision-making before outcomes even occur. The fight becomes less about who is better and more about who is allowed to act without consequence. Islam consistently positions himself as the only fighter in the cage, operating without internal restrictions. This is why even the most accomplished fighters appear smaller against him. Not physically, but functionally. Their range narrows, their options compress, their confidence becomes conditional. They are still elite, still dangerous, but they are no longer expansive. Islam, meanwhile, remains unchanged. His pace doesn't spike. His posture doesn't tighten. He never needs to chase urgency, because urgency is working against the other man. While the champion calculates, Islam executes. What makes this effect so persistent is that it doesn't rely on surprise. Fighters know exactly who Islam is and what he represents. They prepare for it, they talk about it, and yet the effect repeats, because preparation cannot simulate the psychological weight of realizing, in real time, that escalation is no longer a viable solution. When champions understand that the usual escape routes are gone, they don't collapse, they comply, quietly, rationally, and fatally, from a competitive standpoint. This is why losses to Islam often feel different. Fighters don't walk away confused, they walk away aware. Aware that they were never allowed to fight on their own terms. Aware that nothing catastrophic had to happen for control to be lost. Aware that the margin between safety and surrender was thinner than expected. Islam doesn't take something from champions, he convinces them to give it up, and that is why this pattern is unlikely to fade. As long as Islam Makhachev continues to present a system that punishes identity rather than mistakes, champions will continue to fight differently against him. Not because they are lesser fighters, but because they understand the cost of being themselves in a fight designed to erase certainty. Against most opponents, champions impose. Against Islam, they negotiate. And negotiations, inside a cage, are never won. When people say Islam Makhachev is dominant, they usually mean results, wins, titles, control time. But that description misses the real mechanism at work. Islam doesn't dominate by overwhelming champions with force. He dominates by changing the terms under which they are allowed to be themselves. Against Islam Makhachev, greatness doesn't disappear. It gets restrained, negotiated, and slowly boxed in. That is why these fights often feel quiet. There is no chaos, no desperation, no dramatic collapse. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of options, a steady reduction of expression, until even the best fighters in the world are operating inside limits they did not choose. They are not beaten into submission. They are guided there by logic, risk, and inevitability. This is the danger of Islam Makhachev's system. It doesn't need mistakes. It doesn't need openings. It only needs time and understanding. Once a champion realizes that escalation carries irreversible cost, the fight is already being decided, not on the scoreboard, but in the mind. And at that level, once identity is compromised, outcome usually follows. So when you watch champions fight Islam differently, don't mistake it for fear. It's something more unsettling than that. It's recognition. Recognition that this is not a fight you can force, rush, or outthink in moments. It's a system you either accept or slowly disappear inside. And that is why, long before the final horn, even champions already look like they know how this ends.